There it is. Woohoo. All right, let's get going so you guys can get some sleep, right? Must be tired. All right. So, time period 3, I have 2 documents, 6 questions related to time period 3. It's very possible one of my classes will get a short answer question about the causes of the American Revolution, right? Or the revolution related to the revolution. Okay. Okay. Start with the French and Indian War. I'm going to get right to the questions. So French and Indian War, very important. One, it demonstrates Native Americans allying with Europeans in order to survive. French have the Hurons and Ottawa. English have the Iroquois. They're fighting over control of North America, right? French, English, what do they want? They want the fur trade, right? The English also want land so that they can, bring more people over to the Americas. So again, simply, that trade, the under mercantilism, England needs colonies for their economy, right? They need the raw materials and they need a market to sell their manufactured goods. So again, in this case, it's the fur trade, competition over that trade simply. And again, I think the British saw an opportunity to settle more people in the West, right? Pretty simple. Why is it important, right? Simply, France is out. They're kicked out. It's over. England now controls what is today the United States of America and Canada. War debt, right? It was very expensive. And now you have to, protect the colonies from, the Spanish or maybe another French attack. So having North American colonies and having this land was very expensive. So it led to taxes, right? It led to more regulations, which we know led to the American Revolution. Even though the colonists helped the English, the colonists didn't really like the English military leadership, and the English didn't like the colonists. So a lot of animosity started to develop. Even George Washington got fired by the British. And so I think American colonists just started to dislike the English. So you're just seeing a fight brewing, right? You're not writing an essay, but if you were writing an essay about the causes of the revolution, you'd start out with like the French and Indian War and how that would lead to, the revolution. England ends this salutary neglect policy where the English were kind of neglecting the colonies, right? The colonies could govern themselves. The colonies could pretty much trade with, I shouldn't say there were not a lot of limitations on trade. Smugglers didn't get punished, and that's going to end, right? 1763, that's it. It's time for a revolution. Some people think the revolution was the period of time before the fighting. Some people think it was the fighting. Some people think the revolution was after. What was the real change? The Constitution, right? A democracy, a new country. So the revolution could be one of 3 things. It could be the entire timeline of events. I think the revolution was everything. It was the fight, the events that led up to the fight, and then what happened after, right? The birth of a new nation. So colonists start to move west, and they start to engage in conflict with Native Americans, especially in Michigan. Chief Pontiac started to go after English in what is today like Ohio and Michigan. So what does England do? They don't want to deal with it, so they draw up a proclamation line, the Proclamation of 1763. So again, it's a series of events that push both sides to war. It begins with this proclamation limiting colonial settlement. This is the beginning. This is when colonists start to get upset. This is when they start to, they're not talking about independence, but this is when, like the Civil War, tensions start to ramp up after 1763.
Well, hey there, and welcome back to Heimler's History, and welcome.
if you want to watch a little short video, you can. Again, for every topic that's being tested, I have a Heimler video. So then you get into the British taxes, right? You want to remember a couple of these, but just understand that simply the British were like, hey, listen, we got you. We have virtual representation. Don't worry about it. When we vote in Parliament, we'll be thinking of you. We'll be making decisions in your best interest. And the colonists are like, no. One, we want to, we want some kind of direct representation. And actually, we just want to govern ourselves. So they rejected this virtual representation, and they kind of started to promote that idea of no taxation without representation. I think they just wanted to govern themselves, right? Because they always had been, and they want to continue with that. So what are some examples of actions that kind of started to spark protest, right? The Stamp Act, that was a tax on paper goods. The Quartering Act, which forced colonists to quarter. Now, that's not a revenue tax, but it's just another example of this end to salutary neglect. This is the beginning of what colonists viewed as oppression. The Townshend Act was a tax on glass and tea, right? That led to the Sons of Liberty, going after those Tories who weren't boycotting British products, which led to the Boston Massacre. So Stamp Act, Townshend Act, these are things that are going to be protested. But it's all about they're rejecting this virtual representation idea. They want direct representation, or they want to legislate their own affairs. What's going on here? 1 second. Okay. By 1770, things ramp up quite a bit. We have our Boston Massacre after the Townshend Acts. Then you have a tax on tea, the Tea Act, which actually didn't allow our merchants to buy foreign tea, right? We could only buy British tea, which was cheaper, but it was junkier, right? So we started to smuggle foreign tea, and that led to the Tea Party, which led to the Intolerable Acts. I always remember that one because that's when England shuts down Boston, right? They're like, enough of you guys, we're done. You can't trade anymore. We're taking away your town meetings and your local governments. That's when the Patriots are like, we're going to leave. Like, this is like the John Brown moment, like when Southerners are like, we're out of here, right? There were some other little things, but I would remember, like, again, that the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, those are taxes on products. The Tea Act was just basically like we couldn't buy foreign tea. It wasn't like a revenue. It wasn't like it made tea more expensive. We just couldn't even buy the tea we really wanted. But the Intolerable Acts, again, that was shutting down Boston, and that really, really flipped a switch. Provide examples of how the colonies resisted, right? How did they come together? During the French and Indian War, they tried to come together to help the English, but the colonies didn't want to pay taxes. Then, in response to the Stamp Act, the colonies came together to organize protests and boycotts. That's where, women start to, sew clothing. The Sons of Liberty begin to engage in Stamp Act protests, tarring and feathering tax collectors. The Committees of Correspondence was established by John Adams. In response to the Boston Massacre, we need more intercolonial communication. And then right after that Intolerable Act, our first government, right there, that's our first Congress. The Continental Congress is formed. Eventually, that Congress will declare independence. That Congress will choose George Washington to lead our troops. That Congress will write the Articles of Confederation. That Congress will then, down the road, become our Congress, right? Again, we're inspired by the Enlightenment, this idea of questioning the power of a king. All people have rights. But again, we're rejecting virtual representation, and we seek some kind of autonomy, right? We want to kind of do our thing. legislate ourselves. We want to choose our governors. We don't want the king to choose our governor. We want to pick our judges. The king was choosing those judges, right? And we were tired of that. There were loyalists, right? We did that debate, Tories or loyalists, who wanted to remain, peaceful. They were concerned about the violence. They were also wealthy merchants who were making money off of English trade. Most of these are wealthy urban residents of like New York and New Jersey and Georgia. These are not those North Carolina farmers or those Pennsylvania farmers. These are like urban residents that are making money with this new system, right? And they don't want to see things messed up. Even Ben Franklin's own son, right? They stopped talking to each other because William was a Tory. As far as resistance, right? Boycott, don't buy British goods. That worked very well. That hurt the British economy. The Daughters of Liberty stepped up and they made the clothing for us instead of having to buy it from England. The protest that included tarring and feathering tax collectors, right? Painting the T's on the homes and businesses of Tories so that people knew who to attack, harass, or not buy from. Obviously, the violence. Remember, that little boy was killed in a fight between a Tory and a Sons of Liberty. Smuggling was a great example of resisting. They would smuggle things through lobster traps. I always thought that was kind of cool. They would even destroy British property. A British tax collector ship, the Gaspee, was sunk in 1772. The Boston Tea Party destroying tea, right? So just again, examples of resistance. How did they mobilize, right? Remember what that means. You guys, I'm going over your test on the Civil War. You guys did a good job. Like, what did the government do to mobilize people? What did the people do to mobilize for the war? Well, women, right? Sewed clothing to help colonists survive the boycotts. We know the Sons of Liberty put a lot of pressure on residents of Boston to support the movement. Propaganda, Paul Revere and his famous Bloody Massacre engraving helped sway public opinion. The committees of correspondence got, colonies to communicate and raise funds and raise soldiers and prepare for war. So just colonial mobilization. The Continental Congress, right, formed to come up with a way to develop a military and prepare local militias. Okay. In the Enlightenment, right, had a huge impact on the movement. Even though John Locke was dead, his ideas lived on, and Jefferson is going to use this, right? All men are created equal with certain unalienable rights like life, liberty, and then he just changes it to the pursuit of happiness, but it was property. And this idea that Locke said specifically, if a king is abusing his power, if he's not affording you your natural rights, you can rebel. So colonists are reading these essays and they're like, yeah, what he said. Religion had a huge influence, right? This idea that, the king's like, I'm divine, he gave me the power, God gave me the power. And, people are like, no, like God, everyone's equal in God's eyes, right? These are, Protestant, now they're Great Awakening Protestant colonists who are like, we're all equal. And actually, God has given us certain rights that the king can't take away. So religion was very influential. Again, questioning authority, right? During the 1730s and 40s, people are questioning, Anne Hutchinson is questioning the authority of the ministry, or, questioning these intolerant, strict societies, and that kind of those ideas of questioning, those in power. That idea is still in the minds and hearts of these colonists. Okay, Thomas Paine. So, remember, like, we're fighting in 1775 and we're not declaring independence. So our founding fathers were trying to avoid, a breakup. And the Second Continental Congress issues an olive branch to the king. And he's like, suck it, go away. And then Thomas Paine writes this book, right? Common Sense. And this is like the turning. This is like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. But like, it would be like if she wrote it right after John Brown, tried to raid the South, right? This book came around right at the right time where people were really, really ready to go and they needed like a spark. And his book was the spark. And it made sense, right? They're like, you're right. The king is taking advantage of us, and we should govern ourselves and establish a democracy. And it worked. 120,000 copies, that's a lot back then, and people responded to it, and it really changed the views of a lot of those moderates who were really, really not sure what to do. Didn't really change any loyalist mind, but it's those moderates who were on the fence, right? When we did our debate, we had a few of you, they're like, I don't know, why don't we all work together and try to solve this? They're like, nah, let's go, let's do it, let's declare independence. So that's the spark. Oh, that would be a good source.
Well, hey there, and welcome back to Heimler's.
Influence. The revolution led to more abolitionist societies. Free men started to call for more rights. Slaves started to, hey, listen, I just read your Declaration of Independence and you're not really living up to it. So there was a movement to abolish slavery. Black ministers were becoming more outspoken. Abolitionist societies were growing and developing in New England and Pennsylvania. There were slaves in New England that started to petition for their freedom or sue for their freedom, and they're all going to use a Declaration of Independence, right? A great document would be if Frederick Douglass, on July 4th, 1860, whatever, it'd be, and imagine if he calls things out and, points out the hypocrisy that, and, for 80, 90 years, right? We were very hypocritical. We're fighting for freedom and we're, let's uphold the ideals in the Declaration, but we really weren't. And Frederick Douglass is going to point that out down the road, right before the Civil War begins. Again, they're going to use slave owners, are also going to use John Locke's ideas of right to property, though, right? They're going to be like, well, slaves are our property and we have the right to our property. So it went both ways. Women. Okay. Republican motherhood, right? Sometimes we get this confused with cult of domesticity. It's a little different, right? Let me play the video.
At the end of the war, what is obvious.
This could be a great short answer question, so let's watch the video.
Is that the old colonial idea that women's brains are weak and they're incapable of making political choices or moral choices, rational decisions, is obviously not true. Women have taken sides in the American Revolution. They've made sacrifices. They've risked their life. And it's obvious that they have acted on political loyalties. So when the war is over, the question becomes, so where do they fit into the Republic? Where do they fit into this representative government? So it's not as if after the revolution, the leaders of the country are going to say, ladies, you were so good, we're going to make you citizens, and would you like to run for office? They do begin to think that women can play what they call a civic role in the new republic. How are we going to sustain this new republic? Through patriotism. The next generation of men have to prove to be good patriots. And here is what women can do. Women can raise patriotic sons. In a sense, they politicize mothering. Being a good mother becomes a political act. Now, Republican motherhood, which is what they call it not as in the Republican Party, but the Republic, suggests that every time a mother tells her son, you must be willing to sacrifice for your country, you must believe in your authority in society, that they are doing something that is political. It doesn't mean they have economic independence. It doesn't mean they have political rights themselves. It doesn't mean that they leave the household. But it means that what they do in the household has a civic component. We now agree that they have brains, that they can make political choices, that they can be patriotic. And this elevates, in some sense, the status of women from simply household manufacturers and producers of children to citizens in the new country. They're not full citizens, but they are doing civic duty.
So simply, like, women were not looking for the right to vote. Men weren't interested in giving them that right to vote. But what men were saying is, hey, women, we need you to do more than just have babies, right? We need you to play a role in the development of our democracy. And they embraced that. Women are now told, you have a role here. We need you to participate. We're not saying go out and get a job. We're not saying go vote or hold office. We're just saying we see that you have value. We know that you're important, and we need you to educate children on the American ideals and about America, right? They're still expected to be subservient. They're not. Men don't want them to go work. Men will still be the head of the household. Men will still discipline the children. Women will still be encouraged to, again, women are going to be more empowered to speak out, which is true. Women are going to want more education. They're going to say, oh, well, you want us to raise these children into great Americans. We need to be educated. So it's a change. It's not a lot. Again, they're not asking women to work. They're not asking women to take care of farms. They're not asking women to take care of the house while the husband is working in a factory. That's the cult of domesticity. It's like an add-on. In the 1800s, now women are expected to not only raise children, but to also do the work. Farm, cook, clean, maybe even work. And again, discipline the children, because men are now leaving the house, right? During this period, men are farmers. They're at home. They're farming. In the 1800s, they're now working in factories. They have businesses. So a woman's role will expand in the 1800s, but at this point, it's just basically you're going to teach your family about what it's like to be a good American. That would be a really good short answer question. I just might compare it with something else down the road, all right? So try to kind of understand that, right? Now, women, again, Abigail Adams writes this letter, remember the ladies? She's not saying, John, give us freedom. She's just saying, John Adams, give us a role, hear us a little bit more, let us have our opinions, listen to us a little bit. They're going to question things like physical abuse and physical punishment. They're going to advocate for things like just basically, more humane treatment of women. Mercy Otis Warren wrote poetry. So she is going to comment on politics, but she's not going to write essays or speak out in front of people. She's going to use her art, her poetry, and her plays to do that. But either way, women are starting to feel empowered, right? They helped out during the war. They played a major role in some indirect ways. And now they're like, hey, listen, we can do more. We want to do more. But please remember, no one is thinking about the right to vote, right? Nobody. Even Abigail Adams wasn't thinking about the right to vote. She just wanted more independence in a sense, okay? That would be a really good short answer question. A really, really good one for one of my classes. As far as Washington, there is a question related to Washington, so I'm just going to do a quick, brief lecture on him, and then we're done. Why is he important? He's the first president, right? Everything he did became what we call a precedent. He created the cabinet, right? That advisory group, right? Jefferson was the Secretary of State. Madison was, I don't remember. They were anti-federalists, right? Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury. He was a Federalist. Big, strong government, where the anti-federalists, who would later become Democratic Republicans, were more, concerned about a large government. Anyway, we see the Judiciary Act, where he signs that act that establishes what we have today, a Supreme Court, and other federal courts. So, he and Hamilton build the national bank. They use the military. He used the military to enforce law and order, right? He executes the law. The Whiskey Rebellion, where those Pennsylvania farmers were rebelling over whiskey taxes that Hamilton imposed. Remember what's happening, right? England and France are at war. Both want us to be involved. The French say, hey, listen, we helped you. You should help us. Hamilton thinks that it's important not to take a side because we want to trade freely with both sides, especially England. The English are attacking our sailors. They're kidnapping our sailors through impressment. The English are encouraging Tecumseh and other native groups to attack our settlers. So there's a lot of tension, and basically Washington and Adams are like, let's stay out of it, right? Let's stay out of it. Even the French start to seize some of our ships, right? So it's both countries are testing our patience. So that's a real foreign policy problem. Remember, Washington pursues a policy of neutrality, right? He stays out of it. Hamilton's financial plans stabilize the economy. He assumes every state's debt. He's like, we'll take care of it. Don't worry about it. He establishes a national bank. He does start to tax things like whiskey. He loves tariffs. Actually, he doesn't. I learned that the other day. He did not like tariffs. He did not like tariffs. He's not like Trump. He did not like tariffs. He did like taxes. He did want to encourage business. He stimulated manufacturing using, affordable loans to get people to start making things. So that's really important. Again, the Whiskey Rebellion, farmers are frustrated with these whiskey taxes. They're probably, Democratic Republicans. Washington goes in there with the military. Unlike Shays' Rebellion, where the federal government couldn't do much under the Articles, he kind of threatens them and says, listen, let's talk it out. It works out, but it's mostly important because for the first time, a president has to use the powers of the federal government to maintain law and order, and he does it without a problem. As far as neutrality, he issues a neutrality proclamation. He does sign a treaty with England called Jay's Treaty. Democratic Republicans like Jefferson thought it was an alliance, but it really wasn't. England just kind of agreed to stop inciting native attacks. We agreed to pay back debt. It didn't really solve tensions, but it was an attempt to stay out of war with England, right? It's a treaty, like a peace treaty. Again, Democratic Republicans really were angered by it. They thought we were taking a side, but we really weren't. So, when Washington's president, we start to see political parties emerge, right? Hamilton, Adams, were Federalists going all the way back to the Constitution. They were more college educated. They liked Hamilton's financial programs. They believed that America had to have a more diverse economy, manufacturing and farming. A strong central government was very important. They believed that the federal government had more power than the states. They believed in loose construction, or the elastic clause. Basically, even if it's not in the Constitution, if it's necessary and proper, the president can do that. The bank, for example, right? So this is kind of, and this is going to, when we talk about the Whigs are going to embrace the same things, right? That's the timeline, right? We go from Federalists to Whigs to basically Republicans, okay? They favor neutrality, not an alliance, but neutrality. The Democratic Republicans, they'll become the Democrats under Jackson, same stuff. They believe that states did have a lot of rights. They believe states could nullify a presidential order if it was unconstitutional. They believed in strict construction. If it's not in the Constitution, a president can't do that, like a national bank. They distrusted Hamilton's financial plans. They did not like the Bank of the United States. They wanted a smaller government. They wanted a smaller military. And they believed that a farm economy was the best way to go. They were very much pro-France. So again, if you want to know more, you can watch the little video. But if you know the two parties now, you'll know them going forward. If you can remember some of these things when Washington's president, it's the same thing when Whigs are battling Jackson. Literally, I could be like Democrats and I could put Whigs, okay? Nothing's going to change. So if there's one thing you want to really remember is remember the two parties. Is there a question about it? Yeah, I think there is. There's a question kind of related to the political parties during this period of time, right? And they really didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things, right? They really didn't. When Jackson's president, they're debating tariffs and they're debating the bank and they're debating the only thing they're not debating when Jackson's president, like foreign policy. They're all in. They're all in on expansion. They're all in on forming alliances. But when it came to domestic things, right, the Federalists wanted to, use tax dollars to build things, and Democratic Republicans are like, no, let states do that. So try to remember these differences, okay? Let's see. I'm going to skip that. It's not really that important. All right.
What's up?
I'm going to skip that. All right, let's get to Washington's farewell address. Actually, let me go back because it is actually important. So John Adams and Federalists are in power. They think that Democratic Republicans are too oppositional. Newspapers are too critical of him. And so to undermine the other party, they passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. What do those do? They're being used right now, actually, interestingly enough. One, they deport French immigrants who were voting Democratic Republican. Easy way to win elections when you get rid of the voters. The Sedition Act made it illegal for newspapers and anyone else to criticize Adams. Very similar to what Lincoln does during the Civil War. He goes after opposition or dissension. So basically you're trying to shut up the other party, right? And weaken them. So again, they got so bad politically that this is what started to happen. Congress started to limit freedom of speech, right? They started to deport people illegally without any kind of due process. So we start to see constitutional rights being undermined because of political differences.
What's up, beautiful people? Welcome to Joe's Productions. Today,
I thought that was you guys. Democratic Republicans are like, you can't do that. So they start to introduce this idea of nullification, right? The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions were basically statements, or they were written statements that basically said that if the president or Congress did something unconstitutional, like the Alien and Sedition Acts, or a tariff, like 1828, that a state could nullify that law and not follow it, right? South Carolina is going to do that with a tariff in 1828. And that's when Jackson's like, no, you can't do that. And he sent the army in to collect the tariff. So this is an example where we start to see, Democratic Republicans use that states' rights argument that no, states do have power here. Either way, we see political division, right? We see a lot of political tensions emerging at the end of Washington's presidency. And then Washington leaves and he makes this famous farewell address. This would be a really, really good document on an exam. Simply, he's concerned about the political division. America is divided politically, and he's cautioning Americans about parties or factions. He's also concerned about, being dragged into a war by taking a side, right? We're not in an alliance, but he doesn't want us to enter into an alliance. So he warns us of these future problems, right? And that's it. All right.
Well, hey there, and welcome back to High-English History. Now, in this video,
That's it, guys.
which is part of a
Period 3. Again, what do you focus on? What led to the American Revolution? How we didn't notice I didn't mention the revolution, right? Nothing about the war. I didn't go into the Constitution. Simply kind of understand how the revolution started. What led to basically what led to the Declaration of Independence, right? Out of this, we get a constitutional republic, but political parties start to emerge with different ideologies and beliefs. Washington becomes president. He upholds the Constitution. He sets up precedent, but he also shows concern for that growing political division. So try to, remember some of those facts about those parties. And again, if you know what the parties were like in 1800 or 1790, it's the same thing in 1830, 1840, right? Between the Whigs and the Democrats. All right, that was quick. Thank you so much. Time period 2 and 3.